In Luke, it says, "For there were about 5,000 men." I'm going to add that after Jesus says, "Make them sit down," which is in John. Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And the reason I want to put the number there is because it seems to make the most sense from the point of view of the disciples. It said, "Make them sit down." So if the disciples are ordering them by 50s in a company, it is the disciples who are now figuring out there's 5,000 men here. So that's where I'm going to put it. Instead of before Jesus says, "Make them sit down," as it has here in Luke, and instead of all the way at the end after they collect the basketfuls. It just says in Matthew and Mark, they collected the basketfuls and there were 5,000 men. Neither of those make sense to me. But this one makes perfect sense in John. Make them all sit down, and I'll add by 50s from Luke, and then, before he blesses the bread and distributes it, that's when they know there's 5,000, because they just figured it out. In Luke, it's the most descriptive. I'm going to skip the number, for there are about 5,000 men, just go right to, "And he said to his disciples, make them sit down by 50s in a company." Mark has, "And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass." In Matthew, he has another statement. He says, "Bring them to me," meaning the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The thing is, after that, he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. So in Matthew, he asks for the food, tells them to get the multitude to sit down, and then he took the 5 loaves. And that actually fits very well with the rest of the Gospels, because in Mark, it doesn't have his statement, but after he commands them to all sit down, it then has the next verse. "And they sat down in ranks. And when he had taken the 5 loaves." So they sit down, then he takes the loaves. Luke, "Make them sit down by 50s. And they did so and made them all sit down. Then he took the loaves." So it jives well. John 6, "Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. The men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves." So that works perfectly well. I will still put this statement that Jesus says first. He said, "Bring them here to me," and he commanded the multitude to sit down. I'm not going to have "he said" and then after that put "and he said to his disciples," because all of this is to his disciples. So just like earlier when I said he brought up his 12 disciples, and then later on his disciples said, I want to have the more descriptive language be first. So from Luke, I think I'm going to put "and he said to his disciples, bring them here to me." Then he said from before that, before, "Make them sit down by 50. Jesus is named here in John, and Jesus said, so I'll put his name first, because again, we have to have the most description as possible up front. Then I'll put "and he said" for the second statement. I'm going to take Jesus from John and put that first, But I'll save "and said" for the next statement, which begins, "make the men sit down," because that is what comes in John. So first it'll just be Luke, and then Jesus from John said from Luke to his disciples. And from Luke only, Jesus from John only, said from Matthew and Luke. Luke only, to his disciples. Matthew only for the statement, "bring them here to me." Instead of just saying, "and he commanded," as a reiteration and a mention, this is what he said, but not a quote, I do want to put a quote. So it won't be how Matthew puts it. Mark, "he commanded them to all sit down." Luke actually has his quote, "make them sit down by 50s in a company." John has something similar, "make the men sit down." Make them sit down. I think it would make more sense to have them sit down because, yes, there is 5,000 men, but later on it numbers them. Matthew. "And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children." So there were women and children, but they only counted the men, 5,000. So in Jesus' words, I'm going to have it say, "make them sit down." Because it was men, women, and children. I was going to have just the word "them," make them sit down, because there were women and children there. However, I rethought that because it clearly says in all of them that there were 5,000 men. In Matthew it says beside women and children. So there are women and children there, but they're not counting them among the 5,000. Which means that when making them sit down by 50s, it would have been known that there were a certain number in the 50s. And since only the men were counted among the 5,000, it makes sense that the 50s are the men. They may be maybe the leader of a household, and around them is their family, and that's one man still in the 50. I'm not sure, but I am going to put "make the men sit down," and then from Luke, by 50s in a company. That's how I'm going to put it. Now, "and he," this "he" is from Matthew, it is from Mark, and it's from Luke. So the regular gray that I use for everything else, "he said." I use "said" for Matthew. Well, "commanded," that's in Mark. Should I put "commanded"? I put "said" earlier from Matthew and Luke. Now maybe I should put "commanded" just because it's something new. And otherwise I would just have to leave out that word and repeat "said." So "said" then is also from John earlier. So this would be Matthew, Luke, and John. And then "commanded" from Mark. Also in Matthew. "Them to make all sit down," meaning he's speaking to his disciples. "Make the men sit down." Yeah, commanded them. Now, after he commanded them, "make the men." I know "make the" is here in John. "Make them." So "make" is John and Luke. "Make" is also in Mark. commanded the multitude to sit down. So make is Mark, Luke, and John, not Matthew. Mark, Luke, and John. The men. All. Oh, I can put all. Make all the men. All from Mark. The multitude to sit down. So all from Mark. I'm skipping them because I'm going to put the men. So all from Mark and then the men only from John. Sit down. That's John. Sit down. That's Luke. Sit down in Mark. Sit down in Matthew. Okay, all four. No color. Sit down. Matthew has on the grass. Mark by companies upon the grass. So by companies I'll put first. Or by 50s. Because the company, it doesn't have a number, but by 50s that would be explained. That is still a group. And it's in 50s. So by is Mark and Luke. And that's it. Yeah, Mark and Luke. By 50s is only Luke. Companies in Mark. Luke only 50s. Luke then finishes in a company. Oh, that's perfect. So company. Nope, companies is plural in Mark. Actually, maybe I should change this around and have the companies come first. Make all the men sit down by companies in 50s. Because there's lots of companies and each company has 50. So you're not going to have them sit down by 50s. Well, you could say by 50s in a company. And I guess you would just have to figure out that means lots of companies. But if it's more clear to say by companies, and more specifically each company will be 50s, by companies in 50s. Now, by companies, it should be by companies of 50s. Or by 50s per company. Yeah, because if you say by companies in 50s, you might think that there should be 50 companies only, and you fill in that company with how many it takes in order to have 50 companies. By companies in 50. Yeah, that could be, and so I think it's better like this. By 50s in a company. In a company. And they did so and made them all sit down. Something similar, and they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. Matthew doesn't have anything. So what I have is from John. Now there was much green grass in the place, so the multitude sat down, and they were a number about 5,000. So I have all that. But I have to put from Luke that the disciples did so, and then explain that they're in numbers. So after Jesus says, make all the men sit down, I could say, now there was much green grass in that place, and they did so. Or I could have, make all the men sit down by 50s in a company, and they did so. Now there was much green grass in the place, so the multitude sat down in ranks. Yeah, that's how it'd have to go. I'll have that they did so after the command, and they did so. This is Luke only. And they did so,